It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, I'm going to talk about the first of two back-to-back Monster Mash entries near the end of the Silver Age of Universal Classic Monsters cycle, and that's House of Frankenstein. Now, I use the term there, the Silver Age, that I want to explore a little bit further. To me, the golden age of the Universal Classic Monsters era was like the early days, the films like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, Werewolf of London, The Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula's Daughter, and Son of Frankenstein. These are often listed among the top or the very tippy top of the Universal Classics. These are all the movies from the 30s. The 40s brought the Silver Age of Universal Classic Monsters. I don't necessarily think the films made in the first half of the 40s, which, to the exception of The Wolfman and the color version of The Phantom of the Opera, were, I think basically all of these were all sequels featuring and furthering the classic monsters. And I don't really think that these are necessarily all that bad. There are still some good ones in there. There are even great Universal horror films being made in that time that fall into the classics line that didn't feature the iconic characters, but things were beginning to slow down for the studio in general. After the first four films were released, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Invisible Man, Universal had a change in leadership and horror was greatly deprioritized. I had mentioned previously that revival screenings of these greats made that new leadership realize they had something that was quite popular and profitable. And that's when the films of the second half of the 30s were greenlit and released. Believing this would basically be a forever cycle of sequels, double bills, and revival screening fodder, Universal wasn't really doing much of anything with their iconic characters, just cranking out sequels. The Wolfman and The Phantom of the Opera were certainly exceptions, but things were already kind of getting tired by 1943, but something else happened in that same year that seemed to kind of juice ticket sales. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was a fairly popular movie. It brought two of Universal's most popular monsters together into one movie. Frankenstein's monster was Universal's bread and butter of all their characters. He was the face of the franchise. And then you also had Lon Chaney Jr. in his portrayal of Larry Talbot, the Wolfman. That was also something extremely popular that Chaney immediately became Universal's face of horror in terms of the characters that he would play. He would go on to play Dracula and the Frankenstein monster, as well as the Mummy, along with the Wolfman. And then there was an idea put into action. Do more Monster Mash movies like that. This time, let's throw a bunch of monsters into a single film, and thus House of Frankenstein was put into production. 1944 was the final year of Universal releasing more than one or two horror films a year. Along with House of Frankenstein, Universal had three other movies serving as conclusions to two series. The Invisible Man's Revenge completed that loose series, and The Mummy's Ghost and The Mummy's Curse completed the tales about Karis the Mummy. Now, there are several other horror and thriller films that would later come the 90s that Universal would put a classics banner onto that weren't really the same. But whether we want to truly include some of those movies or not, it's obvious these franchises that they had made most of their money off of were running out of steam, and Universal was running out of effort on these. Now, I also want to say that House of Frankenstein is dated as being premiered in New York City in 1944. It didn't really actually get wide release until 2 months later in 1945. But they weren't going to lie down without trying to juice that box office. Now, House of Frankenstein was advertised to bring together multiple so-called monsters into a single film. We'll get more Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster along with a hunchback, arguably not a monster, but it was the 1940s. So, anyway. And the final two advertised monsters would bring some added interest to the film. The first was the Mad Scientist, in this played by Universal's all-time greatest face of horror, Boris Karloff. And the second would bring back Dracula, but this time played by John Carradine. Having Karloff back was a big deal. He hadn't been part of the Universal horror landscape for a few years. He did do a few horror films and thrillers between the time that he had last played Frankenstein's monster in 1939, but for other, but a lot of those were for other studios. This time he gets to be the doctor trying to revive the Frankenstein monster instead of that monster on the slab. Now, when I was younger and discovering these movies in the 90s, it was Dracula who was the draw for me. Bela Lugosi's Dracula in 1931 was, in my mind, pretty darn great. It was my favorite before I started really getting into the rest of the films from that era and Universal in particular. That said, Dracula for me, and for some reason, a character who had only been used 3 times before this sequel brought him back. And perhaps it was a rights issue, as it wasn't always easy to get Bram Stoker's family's approval to use the character. Perhaps it was the fact that the story itself was fairly well told and self-contained in that 1931 Dracula. It's hard to bring a vampire back from the dead once he is essentially disintegrated. But more likely, it was that Lugosi's performance is often considered the most iconic of all the monsters from Universal, and is often imitated, and his cadence of speech was so well identified as being how vampires, and Dracula specifically, should speak. Dracula's Daughter is a sequel, but aside from mentioning the Count and dealing with Van Helsing staking a man to death at the end of the 1931 movie, not much more is done with the original story. Beyond that, we had Son of Dracula, which found Lon Chaney Jr. In the role as Alucard, which is just Dracula spelled backwards. It just wasn't an idea that was all that well explored by Universal throughout the 14-year history of these films. Now, while House of Frankenstein would be popular among audiences and have a great trailer that counts out the various monsters appearing in the film, it was not super well received by critics. Again, these franchises were showing a lot of wear on them by this point. It didn't help that a lot of these Universal horrors were made to be short, quick, and able to be paired with other films for double features. It doesn't lend a great deal of opportunity to try new or interesting concepts. It's a bit of a shame that a production named Chamber of Horrors wasn't made. This was reported by The Hollywood Reporter in 1943. It was said to include Karloff, Chaney, Lugosi, Claude Rains, George Zucco, and Peter Lorre, and was going to have a bunch of the various monsters that had been in Universal's movies up to this point. That would have been an epic, likely, as it would have had to drawn together these various Universal creatures into a single film, but it was trimmed down and turned into what we would ultimately see in House of Frankenstein. Lugosi would not return to a Universal horror-ish film for a few more years. Karloff was absolutely uninterested in playing the monster again. Rains and Lorre would not be present in House of Frankenstein, and Zucco is downgraded to a very small part in only the first act of this movie. Now, one of the things that almost kind of curses House of Frankenstein is an almost anthology-based story, and with that, I guess we probably should go ahead and get to talking about what happens in the movie. Now, things get started off fast, as there are a bunch of things to do and a handful of monsters to get to, and only 70 minutes to fit everything in. Dr. Gustav Niemann, played by Karloff, along with his assistant, the hunchback Daniel, are prisoners at the start of this movie. Now, Niemann is inspired by Dr. Frankenstein. In fact, his imprisonment has something to do with not just grave robbery, but also possibly various uncouth other crimes dealing with experiments with creatures and bodies and what have you. Daniel is only more than happy to assist Niemann because he yearns for a normal body. Niemann says, with Frankenstein's notes and his equipment and his, with his own findings that he's picked up since studying Dr. Frankenstein, he'll be happy to put his friend's brain into a perfect body. It just so happens that a thunderstorm causes the prison to collapse, giving Niemann and Daniel a way to escape. And they soon come across the traveling showman Professor Lampini, played by George Zucco, whose Chamber of Horrors possesses a casket with a skeleton inside that has a wooden stake sticking out of its chest. Now, Lampini says that he has the skeleton of Count Dracula. Niemann and Lampini talk Count Dracula's legend, and after learning where the good professor is headed, Daniel is ordered to kill Lampini and the coach driver, and the pair take their identities. Their first stop is to pay Burgomaster Huysman a visit in a small town. The plan is to exact revenge for dumping Niemann into prison by using the stake in the supposed skeleton of Dracula's chest to kill Huysman. However, to Niemann's surprise, Dracula resurrects and cuts a deal with the vampire. Do the revenge thing, and not only will he not stake Dracula again, but he'll also serve him and do as he wishes. Now, Dracula ends up taking quite a liking to Huysman's granddaughter-in-law, Rita, and seduces her. And just as the burgomaster figures out that the guy who says he's Lampini is actually the criminal Dr. Niemann that he helped imprison, Dracula strikes and kills Huysman. Now, Niemann is no fool. Huysman's grandson finds the burgomaster's body and calls the town's chief inspector. And as Dracula leaves with Rita, Niemann gets rid of Dracula's coffin to avoid the vampire from leading the fuzz to his and Daniel's location. And with the coffin left in a vulnerable place and the sun quickly rising, at dawn, Dracula is unable to return to his resting place in time, and he dies in the morning sun. And that's the end of Dracula for this movie. This first 20 minutes kind of serves as its own little movie. It's almost like it's continuing or closing out a movie that was made before it that never saw the light of day. And so we kind of get into the more main story of House of Frankenstein. Niemann and Daniel arrive in the village of Frankenstein on the way to get to the ruins of the old Frankenstein castle. And when they arrive, they see a Romani camp where a beautiful young woman named Ilanka is dancing for the locals' entertainment. Daniel is immediately attracted to her beauty. Ilanka is then hustled by a cruel man who wants more than his cut of the money that she was paid by the villagers for her dancing. He begins whipping her, and Daniel throttles the man to death and takes the passed out Ilanka with him and Dr. Niemann. When she comes to, Daniel introduces himself to the girl and brings her tea, and she's quite receptive to the fact that at first that this nice guy is, kind of being kind to her and taking care of her. But she also can't see the hump on his back. When she sees that he is indeed a hunchback, she's physically repulsed by him. But because he was kind to her and saved her life, she still agrees to be his friend and even says that she will spend time with him when he's driving the carriage and talk with him. Now, Niemann and Daniel discover an ice cavern under the ruins of the Frankenstein castle. There, they find the bodies of the Frankenstein monster and Larry Talbot, still in his wolfman form, frozen in ice. The bodies are unfrozen because Niemann thinks that they'll know where the Frankenstein notes are that he's after and where they can be found. Talbot immediately turns human again, but the monster is still inert. Talbot agrees to help Niemann in exchange for a cure to his werewolfism. Talbot agrees to drive the carriage to Visaria, and that's where Ilonka meets Larry, and he doesn't have a hunchback, and so she kind of thinks Lon Chaney Jr. is just about right for what she was looking for in a guy. When Daniel realizes Ilonka is falling for Larry, he's crushed, and it's actually funny when Daniel asks Dr. Niemann why he can't drive sometimes so that he can talk to Ilonka while on the road. Niemann says that Talbot bothers him with his constant lack of patience. I mean, the guy is going to turn into a werewolf and kill the holy hell out of everyone if you don't do something fast, but I digress. The gang arrives ultimately at Niemann's lab after getting the notes from the Frankenstein castle, and Niemann gets things repaired and back up and running. However, tonight is the full moon, and Larry is getting quite impatient. Niemann is a little bit more interested in getting more revenge on some old associates who betrayed him, which then led him to being thrown in jail, and then also reviving the Frankenstein monster. He's even seemingly lost interest in helping Daniel like he said he would. Daniel wants Talbot's body because then Ilonka would be attracted to him. However, later, when Daniel tries to tell Ilonka that Larry is indeed a werewolf, she lashes out at him thinking that he's jealous. She then tells Daniel that she hates him, that he's mean, and that he's ugly. It's a pretty brutal scene. Of course, Larry is the Wolfman, and there has been a full moon, and 3 men of Visaria have been killed. So things are getting more complicated, and when Larry demands something be done as another full moon is coming, Niemann is far too busy with reviving the Frankenstein monster. Ilonka then witnesses Larry transform, and she shoots him with a silver bullet before she's killed. So I guess that's 2 more monsters down. Yes, I am considering Ilonka as a monster because she was mean to Daniel. Speaking of Daniel, he turns on Niemann for not keeping his word, and as he attacks Niemann, the Frankenstein monster gets off the slab, picks up Daniel, and tosses him to his death out the window. He then collects Niemann's body and is forced by the villagers of Visaria to a patch of quicksand where he and Niemann sink to their ultimate demise. So let's get to the 3 things that I like for House of Frankenstein. First up, I really do like the character of Daniel. He's played by J. Carroll Naish, who had like 200 credits in his career as a character actor. He's not just a sympathetic character who gets unfairly crushed by the beautiful Ilonka for being what she thought was ugly and scorns him for the better-looking Larry Talbot, but he's also relatively smart. He worries that Niemann's plans after escaping is a little flimsy because he knows that their bodies will not be found in the ruins of the prison they escaped from. He also has the plan of how to do away with Dracula by tossing his coffin out the wagon in the chase that in the early parts of the film. This hunchback, who is little more than a goon to Dr. Niemann, actually expertly kills Dracula, and that's kind of awesome. But really, you do feel pretty sorry for him. Yes, he kills people for Niemann, but he's actually not a vicious person. He just wants to have a better body, and he's willing to do anything to do it. So he's easily likable, and you do generally like his rapport with Karloff's Niemann. Second, I like that there is some loose canon still at play here with these Frankenstein and Wolfman movies. When Talbot is revived, there's just enough connective tissue to remind us that, oh yeah, Talbot was there because he was seeking help from Frankenstein, and Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. He didn't get the help he wanted and was ultimately kind of betrayed when the guy who agreed to help him ended up becoming obsessed with the Frankenstein monster. It reminds us that these Universal movies are supposedly potentially in one shared universe of sorts. While Dracula and the Mummy never seemed to directly tie in before, it actually does end up at least accounting for Dracula by doing just enough to tie in that movie with this continuity. It's always been fast and loose with the continuity in the Universal Classic Monster series, but it works here. And we feel like Neiman has kind of tied quite at least 3 franchises all together quite nicely. Now lastly, any kind of discussion of this movie really kind of can't go without the mention of how this movie ends in kind of a poetic form. In the closing moments of this movie, Daniel attacks Neiman, who of course is played by Boris Karloff. Who comes to his aid? The Frankenstein monster, the character who made Karloff a household name. When the monster picks Neiman up, there's a moment where Karloff gazes at the monster, and the 2 entities, the actor and the character that made that actor legendary, are looking at each other. It's some sort of like Michelangelo painting at a hollowed cathedral of horror moment. Then their fates are ultimately tied together as they, the final 2 monsters advertised for this movie, are vanquished together. In a movie that isn't exactly the best Universal had to offer during their horror supremacy, this is a well-conceived and portrayed series of events in these final moments of the movie. In a way, it's a great way to end the Universal Classic Monsters legacy, but it wouldn't end. The movie was popular enough to keep things going on life support for a short time longer. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, we look at what did come next for Universal as we go next door to 1945's House of Dracula. Until next week, stay spooky.